More than 400 kilometers away from the Polish capital Warsaw is Medyka, on the Polish border with Ukraine. More than 1 million refugees have crossed into Poland via Medyka since Russian invasion of Ukraine. The Nigerian embassy in Poland says it is also where Nigerians, Africans and other refugees of color say they have struggled to reach because of the allegations of racism at the Ukrainian border. In an attempt to verify those claims, Arise International Correspondent Adefemi Akinsanya has been at Medyka border before briefly crossing into Ukraine, where she sent in this report.
With temperatures falling below -1 degree, even as crowds huddle together in queue for evacuation coaches, there's little warmth to go round. This is Medyka, a Polish town on its border with Ukraine, the busiest crossing point for refugees in cars or on foot. 1.5 million refugees have passed here, desperately fleeing the Russian invasion in Ukraine.
What we're seeing now is the humanitarian side of war and conflict. Just behind me, you've got a massive queue of refugees who are hoping to get onto a series of buses and coaches that have been given to them so that they can make their way further into town. There's a vast crowd of predominantly Ukrainian refugees, and you're expecting that because, of course, the war itself is happening in Ukraine. But more than just Ukrainians have been affected by this conflict. And we've not been able at this point to meet refugees of any other background.
Away from the foot crossing, there's also the border for vehicles, which is where I find Christian Ugwu, the Nigerian Ambassador to Poland.
For the past 2 days, I've not seen any Nigerian coming to Poland, and I decided Medyka is the greatest, crossing point for the blacks. So I wanted to cross over to the Ukrainian side, but the Polish people didn't allow me, in spite of my status.
Ugwu traveled with 2 other Nigerian diplomats and a driver. But the group were initially turned away at the border because his driver, a Polish national, was not with his passport.
So what's the plan for you now here? I'd imagine that arrangements were made before you made this journey to Medyka, only for you to be turned away at the border. What are you planning to do now? What options do you have?
Yes, I've covered over 300 kilometers to come to Medyka, and I must trek, because they said they can only allow me if I will use my leg to trek to the border. That is the next option I have.
Instead of walking, the ambassador left his driver behind and, along with 1 other diplomat, returned to the border crossing. I ran after the vehicle and asked if I could join. They agreed. Together, we drove into Ukraine, immediately seeing more refugees pouring into Poland. Soon after, we're stopped at a checkpoint. We turn over our passports and then wait for approval. The ambassador saying he wants to see if any Nigerian nationals are stuck at the Ukraine border. After several minutes, a senior border officer makes communication, expressing concern over how allegations of racism could cause provocation they say they don't want, especially while at war.
Your people, they studied now.
She admits Nigerians are known to come to Ukraine and peacefully study, but the opportunity to leave the diplomatic vehicle and inspect the border does not come. For certain, it's known that hundreds of Nigerian students remain trapped in areas of Ukraine, including Sumy. The federal government says plans are already in place to begin evacuating them. But here in Ukraine, unable to independently verify the presence of Nigerian or African refugees, were diverted back into Poland, where refugees suffering from freezing temperatures and trauma continue to seek protection from a war that has changed life as they know it. Adefemi Akinsanya, Arise News, Medyka, on the Poland-Ukraine border.
Right, we're now being joined by Arise News International Correspondent Adefemi Akinsanya. Femi, it's a pleasure having you. You're still in Medyka. Keep us up to speed with what is happening in Medyka as we speak now.
Thank you very much, Rufai. Well, just behind me is the foot crossing point in Medyka, which allows refugees from Ukraine to cross by foot into Poland. And you can just see just behind me, there's been a systematic flow of people traveling. Good morning to you here. Where have you come over from?
Lviv.
Lviv. And what has your experience been? Where are you from originally, sir?
I'm from Nigeria.
And how has it been? How long has it taken you to get into Poland?
Well, lucky for me, I live in Lviv, so it's not been the hardest. But
Yes.
I can tell from my friends coming over from Kyiv and the rest, it's been pretty hard. But
I can see you're here with your wife and your child, and it sounds as though you've been in Ukraine for quite some time. Can you give us any insight in terms of any type of discrimination or racism you may have faced at all in this?
me personally, no. I heard about it, but me personally, no. I didn't face any. The people are pretty good to me personally, people I know. So I'm just grateful to be here right now.
What are your plans for your family now that you're in Poland?
That's left to be seen right now.
We wish you all the best. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Well, as I was talking to you there, I saw a man pass by and asked him where he's from. I'm sure you would have heard him say that he is Nigerian and he is married to a Ukrainian woman. They have just crossed the border from Ukraine into Poland with their child. He did say that though he had heard of allegations of racism, it's not something that he himself had experienced, and he is, of course, on his way into Poland. But just to continue on with what I was saying beforehand, in terms of the refugee crisis, Medyka continues to be the main crossing point for people fleeing the war in Ukraine. And in the report there, we were still hearing that there were still Nigerians being kept at the border on the Ukrainian side, and that was why the Nigerian Ambassador to Poland drove 5 hours from Warsaw to Medyka to see if they would allow him. He was expecting to be allowed, actually. He said that he'd already spoken to Ukrainian officials and let them know, and they were anticipating his arrival. However, when he got to the gate, they did not let him pass because his driver didn't have a passport. So he turned back around, which is when we crossed paths. Attempt alone in his car. I asked if I can join him. He said yes, and in the car we drove into Ukraine. We did pass over, and when we came to a checkpoint, we were apprehended. More and more officers came and surrounded the vehicle, and then we were approached by someone who seemed to be a senior border official who was speaking to the two diplomats, and within their conversation, no matter how lengthy it was, it did end up with us not being able to verify independently for ourselves. However, they did tell us that it had been more than 2 days since they had last seen a Nigerian student or an African trapped at the border or crossing the border, and that corroborates what the ambassador himself had said. So we were unable to independently verify what we were seeing, but you've just seen a man of African descent, a Nigerian man, pass by with his family, and he says that as it stands, that has not been his experience fleeing this war.
Right, Adefemi, I never get the chance to tell you, but you are doing an absolutely amazing job, so I need to start there. But I wanted to ask you, do we know if any Nigerians are taking up the Russian government in what has been described as quite an insulting offer from some Ukrainians? The Russian government has said that they are going to provide a safe corridor for Ukrainians fleeing from the shelling to enter into Russia. Obviously, Ukrainians do not want to run into the arms of who they perceive to be their enemies. But do we know if any Nigerians are going to flee to Russia?
It's a geographical issue now, Tundun, and it's so great to hear from you, but it is a geographical situation. One of the reasons why we're less likely to see more Nigerians crossing into Medyka is because most of the Nigerians who needed to cross have already done so, and those who are still trapped in Ukraine are trapped in areas like Sumy. And if at this point, we of course know that they are still trapped, many Nigerians and Africans, hundreds of them are still trapped in Sumy, but hypothetically speaking, even if they were to be allowed to exit Sumy through these corridors and cross into European countries, it wouldn't even be borders like Medyka, because geographically they are too far away from where they're based. So they're more likely to cross into countries like Slovakia and Hungary. But as it stands now, they are still trapped. And yes, we have been hearing that there are plans in place, collaboration with the Russian and Nigerian authorities to establish safety corridors so that people who are trapped in Ukraine, Nigerian nationals, but also Ukrainians themselves, will have the opportunity to leave and evacuate safely. But as you've said, the option on the table that we've been hearing is that one that would have these people cross from Ukraine into Russia, and likely that is not going to be a viable alternative for many people, most especially Ukrainians. But for the Nigerian and African students, any way out, it seems, will be the best thing for them. I've spoken to the sister of a student who's currently trapped in Sumy, and when I spoke to her about the update from the Nigerian Federal Foreign Ministry talking about them starting the evacuation process and them allowing them to evacuate from Sumy, she said that they didn't believe it, that talks had collapsed 2 a.m. the following morning in terms of them establishing a safety corridor. So it's still very, very unclear. And as it stands now, there are still hundreds of students, Nigerians and Africans alike, who continue to be trapped in areas of Ukraine like Sumy. And should they even make their way out, it is unlikely that they will come to Poland because it's too far away. So we are likely to see, when that does happen, more and more Nigerians fleeing into countries like Slovakia and Hungary.
Okay, Adefemi, it's good you touch on the plight of students in Sumy, because yesterday we had Ambassador Nuhu, who is the ambassador to Hungary, Slovenia, and Poland in that region. And she gave us concrete assurances, well, concrete in quotes, that the Nigerian government is making efforts. But, you know, from some of my friends who have children in Sumy, some of them 3 children, some of them 4 children, we're told that Nigerians in that part of Ukraine are now making their own personal efforts. I hope you have some information for us, additional information, in terms of what the government is doing with regard to that safety corridor, a safety corridor that the Nigerian government agreed with the Ukrainians, with the Russians not being part of it. And then you talked about trekking. How many miles, how many kilometers do people have to trek to get to Medyka? Because the gentleman you talked to, you were talking about people trekking. I don't want to imagine that anybody would trek for 300 kilometers.
Thank you, Dr. Let's start with the last part of your question there. Just behind me, I'll cross back over to this side of the border, and you can see that it's over this green fence here. That is where the refugees are coming from, and it's understood that towards the right-hand side is where more vehicles and coaches are coming. So what we're hearing is that on the one hand, people are disembarking from the cars and the coaches that they came in to walk through this way if they don't have plans to cross into Poland with their vehicles and continue their journey on that way. So that is the reason why many people are opting to walk. It could be a situation where they've gotten to the Poland border and the queues of vehicles are too long for them to wait, so they think that they would get to this part of Medyka and onto the buses and to the transport far sooner if they were to walk. In terms of the evacuation corridors, that is something that has been in the works with the Nigerian government, with Ukrainian and Russian authorities for more than a week, and it's still unclear when that process will formally start. You'll all be aware that still many Ukrainians who are still at this point trying to flee this war are coming under attack of bombardment. We've seen harrowing images of civilians trying to flee and being struck by missiles, and that continues to be a huge threat, which is why many of the students that we have been in contact with are choosing to stay in their bunkers because they have no other choice. And it is quite a serious situation. So we are calling on, many people have been calling on rather, the government to give them more insight into how this is supposed to happen. there's also some form of an economic side to the evacuation process. Some students in Sumi say that they've been in contact with private car drivers who are charging them extortionate amounts to drive them towards the border, towards the safety. We're hearing fees of $500 to $800 per person to get into these vehicles and drive out of Sumi, only to have those people cancel on them at the very last minute. So many people are relying heavily on the governments of their respective nations to allow them to make a clear and safe way for them to exit this war and cross over into safety.
Well, thank you very much, Adefemi Akinsanya, for your courage and for your award-winning, very consistent reports. Keep safe, I keep saying. Thank you very much indeed.